So today we're talking Chaos Space Marines and some of the strongest and weakest units in the new Chaos Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where over the last few weeks we've been making a fair few videos about new Chaos units. Today I thought we'd bring it together somewhat and do a bit of a run through of which lists are looking strongest and weakest in the new book. With that in mind, we're going to be talking through every single unit in Codex Chaos Space Marines, and plus a few extra ones. I thought we'd do the Cult Marines as well, and Khan the Betrayer, and also a couple of the more interesting choices from Forge World. With that in mind, I've organised the units in the Codex into 5 different tiers, starting with Tier 4 the weakest, and I'd usually end with Tier 1 being the strongest, but I thought that a couple of the datasheets were just so strong that they warranted a level above the rest, so we have a tier of Chaos Ascendant at the very top. The rankings are largely based on what people have been running in competitive lists, plus a bit of my own opinion. I do know that it's fairly early in the day for the Chaos Codex though, and also these units might be more or less useful depending on what legion that you play, so that'll have a bit of a bearing too. These tier lists always tend to be just a little bit arbitrary, and there's plenty of choices that I could have happily ranked one tier up or one tier below. If you think that there's anything that I've too drastically got wrong, please let me know down in the comments, and maybe I'll post a pinned correction if I'm convinced. In any case though, let's go through the Chaos Codex unit by unit, talk about how strong they are, and why I've ranked them where I have. First up, we'll start with Tier 4. These are the units that I think are rarely going to get included in competitive lists, just kind of outshone or don't really work all that well. First up, we've got the Predator Destructor, which I think was by far the weaker out of the 2 Predator datasheets. It did get Toughness 8, but the autocannon remains just the same, and I don't see any reason why you'd take this other than the cheap Annihilator, who's got those rather nice Soul Shatter las cannons for d6 plus 2 damage. For gun platforms in the Codex, it does seem like it's one of the worst now. The other unit that I've ranked down here is the Noctilith Crown, and even for this one for Tier 4, I was a bit debating whether it should be up in Tier 3. I don't think it's useless, but I think it's very rarely going to be the strongest choice. What it gives you is an expanding aura of 4+ invul saves. It is kind of handy, though it's not that helpful when it's locked just to one area of the board. For the first few turns it doesn't really cover all that much. Otherwise it gives you a small ranged attack, and it gives you an ability to command point farm with Dark Apostles, though again that does mean that you've got to keep the Dark Apostle at least somewhat close by and limit where they want to go on the board. As I said, I genuinely don't think it's terrible. In theory, if you can keep a Dark Apostle next to it all game long, then you can have up to 5 free CP without having to compromise the press. Plus the Invul Aura will be helpful, particularly on the later turns when it gets to a point where it's actually going to cover a lot of the board. As a fortification though, it's really going to struggle to set up if you've got any sort of terrain dense board, and that's always a bit of a risk unless you can guarantee that you're going to be able to deploy it somewhere useful each mission. If it's going to be forced to set up somewhere towards the back, then it's going to be far less good. Overall, I don't think it's useless, could have been in Tier 3 maybe, but I feel like the vast majority of Chaos lists probably aren't going to pick one of these up. Next up we get into Tier 3, units that I all think are usable, but generally a bit overshadowed or redundant behind other stuff. First up we have the Hellbrute, which doesn't have particularly overwhelming numbers. Both the damage and the defense are kind of so-so for the points cost, though I must admit I do quite like Fire Frenzy, the option that it gets to return fire if it isn't killed. I think I'd generally be more tempted to use this guy as a gun turret rather than a dual threat, as it's just a little bit slow for getting into melee with only 6-inch movement, plus you rarely want to advance it due to having guns most of the time. But I think it does remain interesting as a core unit that can access chaos marks and things. Say having a mark of Zinch can actually save you a fair bit of damage on this guy, and could make him sort of tempting. I still think perhaps not an optimal source of firepower, but perhaps given las cannons, missile launchers and a mark of Zinch, you've got a pretty annoying little unit to deal with, and hopefully it could return fire quite cheaply for Fire Frenzy. Next up we have the Land Raider, which is certainly massively more interesting now that it gains toughness 9 and some actual half decent shooting with the Soul Shatter las cannons. Now it's genuinely going to be something that you can use to deliver squads into the midfield a lot more safely. If your opponent doesn't have some truly powerful anti-tank weapons, then it's not going to go down at all easily, shrugging off things like melters and lances, wounding on a 5. I still think that despite that, it's just not all the easiest sell of a unit. Its damage is okay, but not quite as good as dedicated fire support platforms. A lot of units just don't really need the transport, as they're happily able to move the same speed as it just by advancing or something, and you can have twice as many bodies on the board if you don't take a Land Raider. And if you are using it as a transport, then it's still vulnerable to having chaff infantry touch it in combat and making it have to fire all of its fancy guns at them. Far more usable than before I think, but still I think it's rarely going to be a sight compared with just running mass heavy hitters on foot. Next up we have the Forge Fiend, which I was weighing up between low tier 2 or high tier 3, and could be happily persuaded to put it in either. I have seen a few people running these since the book dropped. Ectoplasma cannons are quite nice general purpose firepower with decent AP and damage 3. And like just about half the things in the book, it works very nicely with a Master of Possession, potentially getting a 4+ invul save, or Warped Mark for +1 to wound on those big guns. Still though, for the cost I think the raw damage and defense are just kind of okay, not particularly standouts, hence I've not ranked it one of the highest units about. Next we've got the Predator Annihilator, far stronger than the Destructor I think. This one does have the D6+2 las cannons on the turret, which does make it kind of interesting for that kind of firepower at long range, and again like the other version it gains toughness 8, so it's at least somewhat hard to remove. I still say it's probably on the lower end of tier 3 sadly. Doesn't compete enormously well with the other fire support choices, but it is far less bad than it was before if you want to run one. Next up we have the Chaos Bikers, another unit that I could have put in tier 2 as well, on the upper end of tier 3, but I think for the majority of Chaos lists people are probably going to prefer Raptors or something heavier hitting like Warp Talons. They are quite interesting in a fast unit that can take both a mark and an icon, but at the same time their damage is really quite anti-infantry, and I don't really think that their special weapons are particularly exciting for the points cost. Maybe not bad for cheap fast moving threats, and I think they're a fair bit more interesting in Red Corsairs where they get to advance and charge for a massive threat range, plus they also get their own biker stratagem in that warband. Maybe a tier 2 there, they look particularly interesting with Khorne for +1 strength and extra AP. They can get rather a lot of strength 5 AP2 chainsword attacks. Also down here I've ranked Fabius Bile, who I think is more underwhelming than the majority of special characters out there. I think they haven't really managed to balance his rules very well in the new book. He just seems annoyingly underwhelming even in a Creations of Bile army, and it seems a bit weird when his own specific warband, could take or leave him, is not an auto-include. Perhaps his biggest issue is that he has to augment core units, but he can't augment any with marks, which means that you're already passing up a fairly easy, quite powerful boost right out of the gate to try and get the random one, which you can't even guarantee to be +1 toughness anymore. His augmentation thing is good but a bit random, and he just doesn't really do all that much damage in himself. He's okay into elite infantry, but by no means better than most of the other special characters in the book. Finally for this tier we have the Defiler, an okay general purpose demon engine. It does a little bit of anti-tank, anti-infantry and melee, though I just don't think that the numbers come together into anything particularly outstanding. I'd be more tempted by Venom Crawlers who also give you +1 to cast, or Mauler Fiends that just give you scarier massive melee, rather than this guy who's a generalist, who's okay, but I just don't think particularly great. Again, still something that you could build around if you wanted to, maybe take them in an Iron Warriors list with a Master of Possession, get some Cursed Earth for a decent invul, and Warp Mark something for some extra damage. Next up we're ascending into tier 2, units I consider strong chaos units, pretty usable or necessary in competitive lists, but just perhaps not the absolute standout best units of the entire codex. Don't get me wrong though, I think that in the right circumstances these could make a part of a competitive list, though generally not ones that you want to massively spam. First up in the fast attack we have the Raptors, fairly cheap and fast skirmishing infantry, can be quite good for jumping around doing actions like retrieve data, and perhaps could be interesting for Mark of Khorne for a bunch of strength 5 attacks. They can only do strength 5 AP -1, not strength 5 AP2, as they can't take the icon. I think they're okay as a utility unit, maybe not the ones that you want as your main damage dealers though. Perhaps particularly interesting in Night Lords where they have their -1 leadership, and they're going to have more chance of getting that nice +1 to wound. Next up, here we have the standard legionaries. I have chosen to basically rank all 3 of the troops here in tier 2. I think that all 3 of them are usable for the right role. You're going to want some of them to fill out detachment slots and to have OBSEC on the board, though for most lists I think you're just going to want to take the minimum and then invest in elites. I think it's good to see Chaos Legionaries looking pretty usable though, a very flexible unit that you can use for multiple different roles. You can have cheap units just for holding down objectives in cover with 2+ saves and armor of contempt. That'll be quite hard to shift there. I generally want to take the chainswords over the bolters, as the bolters just feel very underwhelming with 0 AP, and at least theoretically you can make a very dangerous looking chainsword squad out of the unit, give them Mark of Khorne and an extra AP -1 from the icon, and that's 40 strength 5 AP -2 attacks, which is at least going to trouble most targets. Black Legion will find Legionaries particularly interesting as they have that stratagem to turn off enemy OBSEC and score points over them really well. And depending on what's going on in the rest of the list, it might make sense to throw a Balefire Acolyte in the Legionary squad. 20 points for Prescient and an extra deny coming from the unit really could be a very nice upgrade if you've got something worth buffing. Overall, pretty glad that they're usable, though maybe not to the point that you'd want to take entire armies of them. On the flip side, cultists are just very underwhelming for their damage and defense, but they're still going to be important as a troop slot as they only cost 50 points for 10 bodies and they do have obsec. Basically, if you want to just plow all of your points into elites and heavy hitters, then holding an objective on the backfield for 50 points is pretty great. If you can hide them out of line of sight, they'll do it just as well as legionaries, and it's pretty nice if you just want to invest the bare minimum in a squad that's going to be holding objectives, screenings, or doing actions. Bigger units do have some interesting stratagems, I guess, as well, like cannon fodder for protecting key Iron Warrior units. Alpha Legion have a fair few synergies with cultists, and also you can shoot into melee for 1 CP against them, which is quite interesting in theory to have the enemy locked up with these guys, and then still blasting away at them with a core unit. Next up, we've got the Sonic Soldiers of the Emperor's Children. I felt like the Noise Marines add up to a fairly solid firepower unit, dealing good general purpose damage and getting a nice bonus when they're within half range with their weapons. I feel they can be fielded in big units for buffs and things, or potentially just smaller units to use maximum blast masters, and in general I feel like they're far more useful within the actual Emperor's Children themselves, where they get to be troops, obsec, and get that excruciating frequencies stratagem. Overall, a fairly solid core firepower unit. Next we have the Havocs, really quite effective core firepower once more. I quite like the las cannons, auto cannons, or the Reaper chain cannons. Kind of interesting that they basically stayed exactly the same points cost from the one update to the other. Retain move and shoot, and still have toughness 5 but gains 2 wounds for a lot more toughness. Not a bad firebase and okay for things like Veterans of the Long War or specific character buffs. Overall I'd say they're very usable and effective firepower. The Corn Lord of Skulls I think has had a bit of a side grade in the Codex. Its melee, damage, and defense all did get a bit better, but it also went up massively in points. Despite not being cool, there's still a fairly remarkable amount of buffs that you can still put on this thing, though maybe not quite as much as the previous book where you could warp time it up the board and then also re-roll all hits with Demon Forge. Still though, buffs go a really long way when you put them on almost a 600 point unit. Getting 4 plus invuls, plus 1 to wound, or plus 1 to hit are already quite available from cheap characters. It is pretty much a threat that you can't ignore. I still feel like it does have some pretty major downsides though, like Lord of War interaction with terrain, and its defense for the points is good but not outstanding if it is focused down with high power anti-tank weapons. Still though, with a ton of wounds and armor of contempt, it is going to be fairly hard to kill. Next up, we've got the Mauler Fiend, which I felt like when its profile came out in Thousand Suns, it perhaps wasn't quite as exciting. With access to a bunch of inherent Legion traits like Word Bearers though, these things just hit remarkably hard. D3 plus 3 damage with a bunch of attacks, plus followed up lightly with a bunch of Lasher Tendrils. Get reroll all hits on that and you're in for a good time. And again, like just about every second thing on this list, amazing with the Master of Possession for the invuls or damage boosts. Next up we have Cursed Cultists, which are another decent troop slot in my opinion. I do like the way that they've basically made the 3 Chaos troop choices viable in different roles. These guys are an interesting sort of horde unit, and interestingly having a bunch of mutants to shield a fair few torments means they can hit quite hard in combat, and they don't actually lose much combat efficiency until the bigger models start to go down. They can't get all that many buffs seeing as they're a cultist unit without a legion trait, but fairly dangerous, kind of annoying to remove with ignoring most leadership and regenerating models, and not bad if you want to throw something annoying forward to midfield objectives. Still though, the other 2 troops have their advantages. Cultists are just really cheap if you just want cheap actions and screening, and Legionaries can get all the core synergies and things, better upgrades, and a hard to shift in cover with Armour of Contempt. Next up we've got Khorne Berserkers. I've been over their new rules when the World Eaters White Dwarf came out, and I still think that they're probably much more interesting for World Eaters than just about any other Legion. Becoming troops and having objectives secured means that you get a genuinely quite threatening melee squad in the troops. They get a very large amount of Strength 6 AP3 attacks on the charge, 5 attacks per model for 22 points, and 6 attacks if you happen to be World Eaters as well on the charge. Perhaps not too different to Legionaries, but just geared towards a lot more damage dealing than durability. Definitely very usable, maybe interesting to have piling out of rhinos maybe. Next we have the Dark Commune, the cultist command section with the Priest, Psyker and Banner Bearer. I think that as a unit they're at least reasonably efficient in terms of buffs, but also kind of niche, and you're often going to be better served with some of the other HQs. I feel like they've really come into their own with the Cursed Cultists, where they get the reroll ones to hit as default, never mind say Prescience and the chance of a prayer. and if you just want prescience and dark zealotry on the go, then they'll do that pretty well. I feel like just for a lot of practical armies though, you're either going to want a standard sorcerer or a dark apostle to access the other prayers and the other psychic powers, and plus these guys aren't particularly good in a fight and are quite easy to kill if they're exposed. Still though, I think they have niche uses, and they're potentially interesting with doing gamey things with lookouts, so as they're a really big unit that has character protection. The Helldrake next, and I feel that this guy is quite a lot more interesting for Chaos Marines than the Thousand Sons. It still feels like it's paying rather a lot of a premium for the mobility, but the Baleflamer and Let the Galaxy Burn are at least fairly threatening. An average of 6 shots hitting a Strength 6 AP2 damage 2 is going to do at least some work to heavy infantry. They can also be good for move blocking and some nuisance charges as well, but I think you'd usually just want one or two of them maximum, as they're not particularly efficient damage dealers paying such a premium for the speed. The Vindicator I think is perhaps the most interesting out of the various different Chaos armor options. Its Demolisher cannon got a rather nice tune up with the updated rules, getting D3 plus 3 shots and AP minus 4, plus an extra wound on the defense. It can still be a bit on the swingy side with the D6 damage, but I feel like it's still kind of interesting as a bit of a distraction card effects unit, a unit that you can push up towards the enemy, and they are going to have to try and deal with it, as it does have a chance of rolling really high and smashing something important. Perhaps just a little bit risky to be relied on too much though, as it does have blast weapons that can get tied up in combat, and it does have to get at least somewhat close. Next up, we've got the trusty Chaos Rhino, a nice cheap transport with no extra frills, can be a good battlefield bunker to deliver things like elite infantry, maybe chosen Havocs or legionaries, or perhaps Khorne Berserkers, Noise Marines, or Plague Marines. They're cheap and effective, just like in any other codex, fairly usable, though I must admit a lot of units will do absolutely fine without. I'd say the Cult Marines are maybe the most interesting things to put in them, perhaps, typically having a bit more damage than they do defense. I'm not going to go through the entire Forge World section for Chaos Space Marines, but I thought I might mention just a couple of the stronger choices. I know at time of recording that Games Workshop will at some point issue an FAQ to update the Imperial Armor Compendium, so we might get a few rules tweaks there. I suspect for the most part though, it's just going to be updating the relevant keywords so everything works okay. In terms of fun datasheets though, I think that the Chaos Contemptor Dreadnoughts are pretty interesting. They're core firepower units which are quite good for buffs and rerolls, plus they can also take marks. Both Volkites and las cannons are fairly interesting. Decimators are a nice demon engine that can farm out a bunch of mortal wounds, and as always with demon engines will work okay with Masters of Possession. The Dreadclaw drop pod can deliver some damage dealing infantry, particularly good for ranged things like Noise Marines, and then it can be an annoying floating threat for the enemy to take down. And there are plenty of other things that I think are at least reasonably viable, perhaps things like Leviathan Dreadnoughts or the Sakaran tanks. I feel that these three are perhaps the most interesting though. Chaos Contemptor Dreadnoughts are efficient core firepower vehicles, which is quite rare. Decimators ranged mortal wounds are kind of unique in 40k, and Dreadclaw pods allow you a pretty nice alpha strike. Finally for tier 2, I've chosen to rank the majority of Chaos characters here. All of these are absolutely fine, and there's nothing wrong with including them, but I feel like they're maybe just not quite as outstanding as a couple of the other choices. First up, Lords and Terminator Lords are quite nice places to bear relics, good combat stat lines, and have their reroll ones, leadership aura, which will be good for your core units. Could be an interesting choice for demon weapons as well. Then we've got Sorcerers and Terminator Sorcerers. I feel like the Dark Hereticus discipline perhaps isn't quite as interesting as the Malefic one, but there are still a few good spells there. Prescience is really nice for a +1 to hit, though you can potentially get that on Legionary squads, and then Death Hex for ignoring imballs can really ruin an elite squad's day. And while Warp Time did get quite nerfed, it is still good for delivering shooting units if they need it. The Warpsmith now gives +1 to hit for a vehicle as well as repairs, pretty good for any really big single vehicle, things like Lords of Skulls, or potentially alongside Contemptor or Leviathan Dreadnoughts. The Exalted Champion's good for some cheap rerolls. He does have a fixed loadout now, but at least he is fairly fighty just at base. And otherwise I'd rank a fair few of the special characters here. Huron Blackheart of the Red Corsairs, quite nice for his full rerolls and good melee profile. Lucius the Eternal is a pretty amazing character killer. Cypher maybe doesn't do all that much damage, but he's pretty annoying to remove and can mess with enemy CP. Harken World Claimer is locked to Black Legion, which is a bit annoying, but getting 4 rerolls and a fast moving, hard hitting profile are both good things. And Khan the Betrayer of the World Eaters I think is a bit less standout following the update for him. He did pretty much get worse. but still fighting twice with a ton of dangerous attacks goes pretty well. Next up though, let's get to Tier 1, some of the most standout Chaos units in my opinion, and I'd expect stronger Chaos lists to be making fairly heavy use of a fair few of these units. Still though, as I mentioned at the start of the video, I have ranked a couple of the units even higher than these guys, and we'll get onto those at the end. First up we've got the Chaos Terminators, the biggest and most points intensive core unit, which is usually going to be a good thing. 2+ saves with Armour of Contempt are great. They've got a nice bit of combi bolter shooting to shoot down some light infantry, and then a general purpose melee profile either with accursed weapons or upgrading to power fists for some work against heavy units. They really can be an absolute anvil of a unit when they've got buffs though. They're an excellent choice for the Black Rune of Damnation for -1 to hit. Most of the Chaos marks will give them some really nice benefits, particularly Mark of Slanesh allowing them to cast Delightful Agonies on them for a 5+ feel no pain. They've got a +1 to hit stratagem for whenever they need it, and can be good with just about any other buff that you have out of the individual legions, or things like the Dark Apostle's Illusory Supplication. I think I'd be most tempted just to run a big unit of 10 of these and support them well with a character or two. Next up we have the Possessed. I have already made a full video on these guys if you'd fancy searching it up, but I do feel that they're one of the Demonkin powerhouse units of Chaos, fast with a 9-inch move, tough with toughness 5 and 3 wounds, and pretty dangerous with a bunch of strength 5 and damage 2 attacks. Really not bad for 28 points, and they're a very hard unit to ignore. Just for raw melee might, they're perhaps one of the best units with the Master of Possession buffs. Just about any of them work pretty well with them, and they're also awesome in Word Bearers as well, things like the reroll wounds in melee stratagem, or that Master of the Union Warlord trait, which gives them an extra pip of strength and AP. I think they're pretty usable either in small or big squads. Big squads are great for buffs and destroying other enemy elites, and smaller units will just destroy anything lighter. Next up, and newly in the elite slot, we have the Master of Executions. Often in other codexes, the champion class characters have just been a little bit on the underwhelming side, but this guy really is extraordinarily good for 65 points. He's got 6 damage 2 attacks and a pretty reasonable chance to convert 2 of them to mortal wounds on 6s to hit. That means that if you've got a legion or a buff that allows 4 reroll hits, say for example Word Bearers again, it means that he's going to be averaging around 3 or 4 mortal wounds on the enemy target, never mind anything that he actually does with the axe's damage. On top of that, he's got a really big heroic intervention, gets more rerolls against characters, and you can buff him further with relics and warlord traits if you want to make him truly obscene. He could be quite fun with Flames of Spite or a demon weapon. Overall, really quite a fun countercharge model, definitely a threat that could kill something far more valuable than his points cost in a single turn if you get lucky. Next up we've got the Lord Discordant, definitely an interesting character just from first read of the Codex, a strong all-round datasheets with character protection now, and still very tough with Armour of Contempt and a 2+ save. He's a big threat against anything that he can catch in melee, and particularly so against vehicles. Like the Helldrake, the Baleflame is really potent with Let the Galaxy Burn, a good chance to make a nasty mess of an elite infantry squad as he closes in, and he can take things like marks, warlord traits and relics as well, making him even more dangerous. Could be kind of interesting, run alongside something like a Venom Crawler or a Mauler Fiend as well, who he can help out in melee a bit if he's got no vehicles to melt on the opponent's side. Next up, there's the Demon Prince, another really strong generalist melee choice, and if you're looking for an expensive general purpose choice, then I think he rivals the Lord Discordant quite well. The Demon Princes can make some really fun melee builds. They have flat 3 damage melee attacks, and that's almost perfect for combining with those really powerful demon weapons. Most of them work really well, to be honest. You can have a bunch of extra mortal wounds with Locker Black, damage D3+3 with Khorne, a stack of extra attacks with Slanesh, and I think that the Nurgle demon weapon's one of the most interesting, to be honest. It just straight up auto wounds, bypassing things like transhuman physiology, and you can't use any rules to ignore wounds from it, so it gets around things like feel no pain, or things like maximum damage 3 caps, such as Abaddon the Despoiler or Catan. Again, as a really big meaty character, he's pretty excellent for warlord traits and other relics as well. He gets psychic powers, which he can just use to amp up his attacks, and it's usually going to be quite hard to avoid if you shell out for wings being fairly fast and with fly. Moving on, we've got the Chaos Spawn, which I probably would rank towards the lower end of tier 1, but I still think that they're really quite interesting. They're a cheap fast attack unit with some melee threat, a bunch of damage 2 attacks, and some interesting buffs that they get from their random mutations. Usually they're quite useful. What I really like about them in the new Chaos Codex though is that if you attack them with anything, then they just regenerate the wounds back to the 4 wounds that they have each. You actually have to outright kill one in one unit's shooting or fighting to actually put one down. I think this is potentially really quite scary for a unit that you might want skirmishing with the other light units about. And I feel that it means that a lot of things that they come in contact with just might not quite do enough damage to put down a spawn all at once, and then they just annoyingly regenerate back to full health again. It just means that they might be a bit risky to attack or shoot with light units for fear of literally doing nothing as the spawn just heals. I definitely wouldn't be going too mad on them, but just for some light grunts to push up onto objectives and be an annoying threat to deal with, then I think they do excellently. Next we have the Warp Talons. For me, I'd weigh these up versus Possessed really, kind of similar in that they're fast melee demonkin, just for a bit of a different flavour. A little bit more speedy and a few other advantages, but not quite as much raw melee might besides against light infantry. Again, like the Possessed, really quite nice with the buffs from the Master of Possession, though they might struggle to keep up with them a bit more than the regular Possessed. And they do have a powerful ability where they have the chance to keep enemies in close combat, so if they can kill something and then pile into something else, then they could stay safe from ranged attacks. Again, just a really quite nice general purpose and mobile unit. Rubric Marines next, and I think it's kind of interesting that these guys are pretty much as strong in Chaos Marines as they are in Thousand Suns. The Warp Flamers interestingly get the Let the Galaxy Burn upgrade, so it means that they get D6 plus 2 attacks on them, really quite scary on Strength 4 AP minus 2 shooting. A full squad of these would get you around about 50 hits at Strength 4 AP minus 2 on the enemy, which is going to ruin quite a lot of targets. Plus you can also add in Soul Reaper cannons to the mix on top of that, and they can get where they need to with Warp Time, which they can cast within the squad itself from the Aspiring Sorcerer. Add all that to being at least relatively durable, being power armoured bodies with Armour of Contempt, plus all his dust against damage 1 weapons, and I think they're quite an interesting little threat. Kind of annoying that the datasheet doesn't come in the Chaos Marine Codex though. Next up, and returning to characters, we have the Dark Apostle. His prayers are more reliable than the Dark Commune, going off on a 2+. I think perhaps my favourites would be Illusory Supplication for the transhuman to hit, can't be hit on 1s to 3s, and then potentially you could switch to Dark Zealotry for full reroll hits in combat when you do get close to the enemy. He seems pretty great for buffing things like, say, Chosen Squads or Terminators, and there are plenty of other powerful prayers beyond that, +1 to wound in combat, or potentially advance and charge for Slanesh marked things. If you're playing Word Bearers, then one of these is almost auto-include, as you can have one casting 2 prayers per turn, pretty much doubling his efficiency. And you can also build one of them to be pretty fighty in certain builds, get in the Black Mace, and maybe use the prayer to buff his own combat prowess. And he can certainly do a good job of beating some heretical faith into the enemies of chaos. Next up we have Plague Marines, which I think are interesting just because they have all that crazy amount of free plague gear. They're a fairly tough unit that's hard to shift with toughness 5, and then you could just load up a squad with things like Flails of Contagion, the Great Plague Cleavers, the Maces and the Axes, and you've got a unit that's both very tough and rather dangerous for most of the enemy units to engage. They've also got access to transhuman physiology from their Mark of Nurgle, and they're potentially interesting to push in a Rhino and get them to where they need to be, or just advance them up the board. They won't be able to pick up any Legion traits, but I think that they're really interesting outside of the Death Guard Codex for any of the synergies that amp up their melee further. They're really quite scary with the gear that they can get, and with a couple of buffs can get even more so. Next up we have the Chosen, 3 wounds and accursed weapons. A pretty weird shift to the unit, but I do feel that they're fairly similar in terms of battle line units to things like Possessed and Chaos Terminators. I feel like you can build around these guys pretty well for that role as well. It's hard not to compare them to Terminators, seeing as they have a very similar attack profile. They cost 8 points less than a standard Terminator, and miss out on that very nice 2+ save and deep strike, and also some combi bolter shots too. Overall, I think that the 2 units are fairly well balanced. These guys can still be a pain to shift with 3 wounds and Armour of Contempt for 25 points, and are another good choice for stats character buffs. They can't take Power Fist like the Terminators can, so are maybe a bit more dedicated to fighting infantry, but it's quite fun that they can take both the Mark and the Icon combo, which does unlock a few extra things, like say Emperor's Children, Slanesh ones fighting on +1 to hit. Kind of fun that they get all 3 Wanton rules if they do manage to kill a unit as well. Could make them additionally more dangerous towards the later stages of the game. Next up we have the Venom Crawler, which I think is quite an interesting cheap demon engine. I would probably rank it towards the lower end of tier 1. but I think that you get some fairly good value out of it between its melee attacks, shooting, and a very nice +1 to cast for nearby psykers. As many of the units, it's really quite nice to run alongside a Master of Possession, amping up their excellent casting abilities and also benefiting from their buffs like Cursed Earth. I think it's pretty reasonable to have one about between the +1 to cast and the melee threat, though on the downside they do explode just a little bit easier than most things. I'd say both the range and combat damage are kind of so-so. Kind of needs to make itself use as both ranged melee and buffing units to be able to really make it worth it to the max. Still though, I think perhaps one of the most tempting out of any of the demon engines. Finally for tier 1 we have the Obliterators, which I think are kind of an interesting one to rank on the tier list, as their actual stat line isn't actually super impressive for 90 points per model, but again, as with just about everything, one of the single best units to get good value out of the Master of Possession buffs. Their range damage isn't super strong, but it is very general purpose. They'll be able to do good work against anything from tank lines to light infantry, and they actually back it up with some pretty decent melee as well. They hit almost as hard against tanks as they do shoot them, and they can also fire their guns in combat now, so they don't care quite as much about being locked up. Still though, 90 points is quite a lot. Very high damage and high AP things will get through them, but they are pretty tough in light cover. Really though, I think it's the Master of the Possession which most convinces me to put them in tier 1. Pact of Flesh on these guys is just insane. Returning a 90-point model to the board each turn is absolutely mental. Plus warp marks for +1 to wound on their shooting is just going to make them better against whatever they choose to target. Having 3 of them for 270 points means you've got really quite a meaty unit to buff. They can't use all the synergies as they are Demonkin and not core, but anything that can target them will usually go a long way. Finally, we have the 2 units that convinced me to make an entire extra tier. I felt I would have cheapened all the other units in tier 1 if I put them down to tier 2, so this one we've got the tier of Chaos Ascendant, where I've chosen to rank Abaddon the Despoiler and the Master of Possession. Abaddon was pretty great in the old Chaos Codex, arguably one of the single strongest datasheets that they had, and Games Workshop really don't seem to have held back on the update either. I think he is one of the single scariest characters in the whole game right now. I did make that video the other day where this guy goes through just about every single character in 40k. There really isn't a lot that can stand in his way and live to tell the tale. First up, he's got a solid stat line with Strength and Toughness 6, 8 attacks, and Strength 9, Damage 3 melee with some extra mortal wounds. Then he's got a whole ton of damage boosts, +1 Strength from Mark of Khorne, fights first from Mark of Slanesh, rerolling charges innately, and he can give himself rerolls to hit and to wound if he does want to go into rage mode and punch something in combat. On the defensive, he can't take more than 3 wounds in any one phase. This means that he's completely impossible to kill in a single shooting or fight phase, which can make him a right headache to deal with, and that rule combines rather devastatingly with the Mark of Tzeentch ignoring the first failed save each turn, making him even more annoying to chip that damage off. He also can't be wounded on a 2+ or a 4+ normally with Mark of Nurgle. He's got Armour of Contempt and a 2+ save, which is great in light cover, and a 4+ invul as well at worst. Finally, as if all that wasn't enough, he's also got lots of buffs for the Black Legion. If he's not using those rerolls on himself, he can make a Black Legion unit reroll everything to hit and wounds, and can do a couple of other things such as buffing charge rolls or putting things in Wanton Massacre if you want to help out their rapid fire shooting. Basically, Abaddon's awesome. It's pretty good just based on his raw melee profile, to be honest. He seems to be so strong that he's appearing in completely unrelated Chaos armies, things like Chaos Knight War Dogs, where he's basically an extra scary Chaos threat buried into their midst, even if he only gives them limited buffs himself. Overall, just crazy value, kind of tempting for the majority of Chaos lists, and particularly so for Black Legion, where he can make any one core unit spectacularly dangerous if he isn't having to fight himself. Finally, and the unit that I must have talked about 10 times already in this video, is the Master of Possession. Pretty much hands down without question the best buffing character in Codex Chaos Space Marines, excellent for anything with a demon or demonkin keyword, and pretty good on everything else as well. His powers are so good that he's pretty good for a choice for relics and warlord traits that buff his casting. Things like that extra cast or knowing more powers are both great, and he's quite nice for any other passive buffing warlord traits as well that you want just behind the lines. The vast majority of the Malefic discipline is very usable to excellent, and perhaps the single best spell out of any of them is Pact of Flesh, the one that allows you to both heal a model in a squad and also bring back a model from that same squad from being dead, potentially restoring a crazy amount of points to the table in one fairly easy cast. If you're doing that with 28 point possessed or 30 odd point terminators, then that's all well and good. As we mentioned, he can do it for obliterators, which just seems absolutely crazy. And as well as that, bringing back models from the dead also allows you some positioning shenanigans, things like suddenly making the charge shorter for something like a possessed squad or terminators. Then we've got Cursed Earth, giving you a 4+ invul to nearby demonkin. Nice for possessed moving up the board, or for a bit more insurance for your demon engines moving up and firing. It'd be absolutely fine if it was just a 4+ invul save, but getting a mortal wound charge protection thing as well adds insult to injury. Then there's Warp Marks for +1 to wound against one given target. Quite nice as it can support demon engines firing from the other side of the map if you need to. Really good on anything that's just charging into combat though. +1 to wound is something that almost everything wants to pick up. Then there's 1 for 6s to hit auto wounding in combat, which is fine but maybe just not quite as outstanding, and mutated invigoration for extra toughness and maybe strength as well. Finally, to top it all off, you could just make him the Mark of Slanesh as well, and also give him the option to cast Feel No Pain on units. This one's excellent on Emperor's Children possessed, but is pretty good on things like Chosen or Terminators too. Currently, if there was ever an auto-include model in the Chaos Space Marine lineup, it's this guy. Kinda weird that at the moment Games Workshop doesn't even have him on sale from their web store. I suspect he might get an individual kit release at least somewhere down the line. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our tour through the Heretics and Warp Spawn of Codex Chaos Space Marines. As always, let me know what you think of the units down in the comments below, and what your takes on the units are from the book so far. As always, happy to hear any discussion and alternate takes down in the comments below. I'll certainly be hoping to make a fair few more Chaos videos over the next few weeks. I'm looking forward to talking some army lists and seeing what Chaos players are coming up with. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see similar 40k stuff and plenty more for the Dark Gods, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that down in the video description below. The channel's Patreon is how I can afford to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, and if you are enjoying quite a bit, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.